Before armies, before empires, before war as we know it, there was survival. The first weapons were not crafted for conquest, but for necessity. Millions of years ago, our earliest ancestors wielded nature's tools, stones and wooden clubs, to hunt, defend, and assert dominance. A sharpened rock could crack bone, a sturdy branch could extend one's reach, and a well-aimed throw could change the outcome of a hunt or a fight. These weapons were not planned nor refined. They were simple, opportunistic, and brutal. A thrown stone might have been the first missile in history. A heavy branch swung in anger may have been the first act of war. But from these crude beginnings, the idea of weaponry was born, and soon it would evolve. A thrown stone could injure, a wooden club could crush, but neither could match the deadliest innovation of early warfare, the spear. Long, sharp, and deadly at a distance, the spear changed everything. Unlike a simple rock or club, the spear was designed. It required thought, craftsmanship, and refinement. First just sharpened wood, then hardened in fire, and later tipped with stone, bone, or metal. With a spear, an attacker no longer needed to be within reach of his prey or his enemy. Distance became an advantage. Power no longer belonged to the strongest alone, but to the most skilled. This weapon defined the hunter and the warrior. Across the ages, spears would pierce through shields, bring down kings, and decide the fate of battles. And for thousands of years, no weapon could surpass it. But even the mightiest tools of war must one day fall to progress. War was no longer just about survival. It became power, conquest, and empire. With the rise of civilization came the first great armies, and the weapons that would shape history: bronze, a metal stronger than stone, more durable than wood. It reshaped the battlefield. The first true swords emerged, short, sharp, and deadly. Spears were tipped with gleaming bronze points. Shields became stronger. Armor appeared. No longer was war just a test of strength. It was a test of technology. But the greatest change was not the weapons themselves. It was how they were used. The lone warrior was now part of something greater. Armies marched under banners, led by generals. Battles were no longer random clashes. They were planned, strategic, and devastating. Cities rose and fell under the might of bronze-tipped weapons. Empires expanded, crushing those who still relied on stone and wood. But bronze had a fatal weakness. It was powerful, but not invincible. Soon, another metal would arrive, one harder, deadlier, and far more common. Bronze shaped the first great armies, but its time was limited. It was expensive, difficult to produce, and only the most powerful empires could afford to equip their soldiers with it. But then came iron, a metal stronger, more abundant, and far deadlier. The shift from bronze to iron wasn't just about better weapons. It was about who could fight. Bronze was a metal of kings and nobles, but iron was the weapon of the masses. Any blacksmith in any village could forge tools of war. Swords became longer and sharper. Spears could pierce through bronze armor. Shields grew larger, covering entire bodies. War was no longer the domain of the elite. It belonged to entire nations. The Assyrians used iron to create an empire built on conquest. The Greeks mastered the phalanx, using long iron spears to dominate battlefields. And the Romans? They forged the gladius, the sword that built an empire. Iron made war deadlier than ever before. But it was only the beginning. Because soon, war would no longer be won with swords and shields, but with strategy, technology, and the power of kings. As iron weapons reshaped the battlefield, another challenge arose: walls. Cities, castles, and fortresses became the new battlegrounds. A sword was useless against stone, and shields couldn't block boiling oil. War had moved from open fields to the walls of mighty strongholds. The medieval world became a game of defense and assault. Castles with towering walls, deep moats, and thick gates protected lords and kings. But no fortress was truly impenetrable. To conquer these fortresses, armies developed terrifying siege weapons. The battering ram, thick wooden beams reinforced with iron, could smash through even the strongest gates. The trebuchet, a massive counterweight catapult, hurled boulders and fireballs over walls, devastating everything inside. Then there was the siege tower. Wooden behemoths rolled up to walls, giving soldiers a bridge into enemy defenses. But not all sieges relied on brute force. Starvation was a deadly weapon. A city cut off from food and water would crumble from within before the first arrow was even fired. For centuries, walls dictated the fate of empires, but as defenses grew stronger, so did the weapons designed to destroy them. And then a new force appeared, one that would render walls and castles useless forever. For centuries, walls and armor protected warriors and cities alike. But then, a discovery from the east would shake the very foundation of warfare. A discovery that turned stone walls into rubble and made even the strongest knights vulnerable. Gunpowder. It began in China. What was first meant to be an elixir for immortality soon became the most feared weapon in history. Fire lances, early gunpowder weapons, spat flames at enemies. Rockets streaked across the sky, sowing terror. But it was only the beginning. Gunpowder spread westward, reaching the battlefields of the Middle East and Europe. With it came the first true firearms, arquebuses, crude but deadly, made armor obsolete. Cannons shattered the once invincible walls of castles. The battlefield was changing. Strength no longer mattered. Now the power lay in lead, fire, and iron. The age of swords and shields faded as armies redefined warfare. Formations of musketeers and pikemen clashed in brutal battles. Sieges that once lasted months were now won in days. The rise of gunpowder forever altered how wars were fought. But this was only the beginning. Soon, war would not only be about destruction, but about strategy, formations, and mass production. And one man would take this knowledge and reshape the art of war itself. Gunpowder had changed war, but now, war changed strategy. No longer was victory about brute strength alone. It became an art, a game played on vast battlefields, where formations, speed, and precision determined the fate of nations. And no one mastered this game quite like Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon revolutionized warfare. He took the chaos of the battlefield and turned it into an organized storm. His armies moved like clockwork, fast, disciplined, and relentless. The old ways of fighting, static lines of musketeers and slow-moving regiments, were abandoned. Instead, war became about mobility, striking weak points and artillery bombardments that shattered entire formations. War was no longer fought by armies alone. It became a battle of nations, fueled by factories, innovation, and destruction on an unimaginable scale. The First World War introduced mechanized slaughter. The Second, it rewrote the rules of warfare forever. 1914. The world had never seen war on this scale. Soldiers dug into the earth, creating trenches that stretched for miles. Machine guns turned battlefields into killing fields. Poison gas drifted through no man's land, suffocating those who breathed it. And when mobility returned, it wasn't through cavalry, it was through tanks. These steel beasts were slow, unreliable, and often broke down, but they were the future. They marked the dawn of modern mechanized warfare. Then came 1939. This was not trench warfare. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war. Planes bombed cities before armies even arrived. Tanks cut through enemy lines like knives. Submarines stalked the seas, sinking ships unseen. And above all, the world saw the rise of a new kind of warfare: air dominance. The battlefield was no longer just land and sea. The sky itself became a war zone. The fate of cities, armies, and entire nations could now be decided from above. But in 1945, the rules changed again. One bomb, one city. The world had seen its first nuclear attack, and suddenly war was no longer just about who had the most soldiers, the best tanks, or the strongest navy. Now war had the power to end civilization itself. War is no longer fought on vast battlefields. It no longer relies on sheer numbers or brute force. The modern battlefield is invisible, silent, digital, and unpredictable. A new kind of war has emerged, one that does not always require soldiers, but can still bring nations to their knees. Drones replace infantry, striking targets thousands of miles away with lethal precision. Satellites track every movement from orbit. Cyber attacks cripple entire economies, disrupting power grids and communications. Wars are now fought in the shadows, where the most powerful weapon is information itself. But this is only the beginning. As technology advances, so does the nature of war. Artificial intelligence will command armies. Hypersonic missiles will strike before enemies can react. Soldiers will no longer just be men and women, but enhanced beings, integrated with machines, faster, stronger, unstoppable. And beyond the Earth, the battlefield extends to space. Orbital defense systems, satellite-based weapons, and the possibility of warfare beyond our atmosphere. War has always been a race. Whoever controls the most powerful weapons controls the world. But in the end, one question remains. Is this truly evolution or a path to extinction?